Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today we're continuing our Reading Russian Poetry series with another poem from Lermontov. Last time we read his poem Angel, or The Angel, written when he was just 17. And today we're continuing with another poem called Rusalka, or the Rusalka, or maybe the Mermaid. We'll talk about what a Rusalka is here in just a moment. But this poem was written roughly 1 year after the other one, so again, a very early poem. But we're going to look at this one today, and then I think in the next several videos I'll continue with Lermontov, and we'll be looking at some of his most famous poems by far. And they all show this kind of uncanny resemblance one to another in terms of these basic themes that Lermontov was clearly obsessed with from a very early age. And it's kind of creepy, a little bit unsettling, honestly. And all of these will culminate in what I think could easily be called, and I'll call it so for clickbait purposes, the most haunting poem in the whole Russian canon. Me personally, I would say that. That poem is called Son, or The Dream. And we'll look at that. That was one of the last poems he wrote in the final year of his life, leading up to his death in a duel in 1841. So he only lived from 1814 to 1841, I believe. A very short life, but he wrote some amazing poetry. We're reading mostly some of his most famous lyrical poems here, but as I may have mentioned, he also is quite well known for his prose novel called The Hero of Our Time, or in Russian, Герой нашего времени, and also for a long narrative poem called Demon, which I've posted on my website. If anyone wants to check it out, I translated that into kind of a blank verse, so I have that whole text available online. And I know students really enjoy that, so at some point I may read through that whole text here on this series. But anyway, let's turn to today's poem. And so first, let's explain what a Rusalka is. And here's a painting by Ivan Kramskoy, a famous Russian artist. This is from 1871. And this shows actually several Rusalki. There are a few famous paintings of Rusalki, but this is one I kind of like the best. Because I think somewhat similarly to Lermontov, it takes a creature that could be regarded as menacing or threatening or somehow monstrous, and portrays these creatures somehow tenderly or ambiguously at best. And we see one of these girls here, one of these Rusalki, with this kind of wistful, dreamy appearance. You see that kind of thing in a lot of artistic depictions of Rusalki. But so what is a Rusalka? Well, this is one of these things, as so often happens in folklore. You see very similar creatures in folkloric traditions. For example, across Europe or even across the world, you see kind of very similar creatures in all sorts of different cultures. But the name Rusalka is obviously a Slavic name. And it's kind of like, speaking very vaguely, the Slavic version of a mermaid. But it's quite, I mean, so you see certain similarities between the story of like Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid and Rusalki, although generally the Rusalka in Slavic folklore is a bit more menacing. And one reason for that is that they're usually assumed to be the spirits of young women who've died somehow tragically, usually by drowning. And so the thought often is that maybe these are young girls who were driven to suicide, for example, by an unhappy love. And so because of that, they've become vengeful spirits who dwell in waters or, on the banks of rivers and things like this. And much like the sirens in the Odyssey, they lure men with their song, and they lure men to the riverbank or the seaside or whatever, and try to drown them. So generally speaking, they're regarded as kind of threatening creatures, although a certain ambiguity always comes out. And one example I can give also is in one of my favorite Russian comedies called "Особенности национальной рыбалки," the peculiarities of Russian fishing, I think it's translated. That one of the characters there, he actually sees a Rusalka, and it's kind of funny, and she lures him, in a very comic way. Although even in that movie, she does lure him towards danger. So it's quite clear that although she's flirting with him on the one hand, she obviously has this very ill intent. So you see this coming out in various ways in any artistic depictions of Rusalki. Another folkloric equivalent I can think of is the Lorelei in German folklore, who live in on the banks of the Rhine and comb their hair or whatever. There's a very famous poem about the Lorelei and how they try to lure sailors to their death. But at any rate, what's so fascinating about the Lermontov poem is I think, unlike almost any other work I can think of, and also very succinctly, in just a few stanzas, he captures this profound ambiguity of this figure of the Rusalka, I think, by simply taking it seriously and imagining almost, I don't know what the existential uh, mode of being of one of these folkloric creatures who doesn't understand the basic plot of their existence, basically. And we'll see this coming out in what I mean by this in a moment. But I think he takes them very seriously and gives them this kind of wistfulness or this sense of longing that in a way is very human, but also, of course, this human longing is made very strange in this context of the Rusalka. Another thing we see in this poem that I think is going to characterize all of these famous poems from Lermontov, he comes back to this kind of basic idea over and over again, is this kind of space that's ambiguously positioned between, for example, life and death. And we saw that in the last poem we read, Angel, but there it was somewhat inverse because we were before life, that we had an unborn soul that was being carried towards life. Later, we'll see this more in terms of a human being who's already alive, but he's sort of on the threshold of death, or maybe in some kind of a weird slumber between life and death, or between earth and sky, or maybe the best way to put it is between sleep, the waking world, which in Russian is called yav, kind of the world of daylight that shows itself clearly, kind of the world as we would normally understand it. And then the realm of son, which of course is on the one hand more obscure and darker and maybe more chaotic, but also may reveal certain deeper truths about the world as we normally think of it. Um, and also here a certain Tosca, and we're going to see this word Tosca used specifically in today's poem. Tosca is, it's often said to be untranslatable, and there's a lot we could say about this. If you want to look it up online, Nabokov gave a famous explanation of this concept Tosca and how difficult it is to translate. Although I will say that to me, I think in most contexts, it actually is quite easy to at least unpack the meaning. And the meaning I would give that I think works most often is an objectless longing, right? So it's longing for something that you can't quite articulate. You don't even know what it is you're looking for, but nevertheless, you feel this deep yearning. And we saw this come out in the earlier poem from Lermontov, Angel, where this soul, once it's born into the world, it feels this inexplicable longing, this желание for something that it doesn't even, it can't really even articulate. But of course, in that poem, we see that it was kind of implanted in the soul. This urge towards transcendence was implanted in the soul by the song of the angel. So again, we're in this kind of space in between this world and some other world, between life and death. Um, and we see in each case the poetic ya, sort of the speaker or the protagonist of the poem, um, having this sort of strange longing that's always expressed through some kind of a song. So that could be the song of the angel, or in this case, the song of the Rusalka. And it's, or later we'll see the song of the nightingale, for example. And the nightingale, because of its beautiful singing, is clearly associated with poetry. It's kind of a symbol of poetry. And so for Lermontov as a poet, of course, he's most concerned with poetry. And we see that for him, poetry is sort of occupies this ambiguous liminal space. And that's where we might say also poetry is born. It's where you hear the music of poetry, where you create poetry. Um, and so anyway, let's dive into today's poem. First, I'll just read through it. Remember to always look for readings by native speakers of these poems on YouTube and elsewhere. But first, we'll read through the poem, and then we'll do a very close reading with all of the vocab and grammar explanations you need to understand it completely. Русалка. Русалка плыла по реке голубой, Озаряема полной луной, и старалась она доплеснуть до луны серебристую пену волны. И шумя и крутясь, колебала река, отражённые в ней облака. И пела русалка, и звук ее слов долетал до крутых берегов. И пела русалка, на дне у меня, играя мерцание дня. Там рыбок золотых гуляют стада, там хрустальные есть города. И там на подушке из ярких песков Под тенью густых тростников спит витязь, добыча ревнивой волны, спит витязь чужой страны. Расчесывать кольца шелковых кудрей мы любим во мраке ночей, и в чело, и в уста мы в полуденный час целовал и красавца не раз. Но к страстным лобзаниям, не знаю зачем, остается он хладен и нем. Он спит, и, склонившись на персы ко мне, он не дышит, не шепчет во сне. Так пела русалка над синей рекой, полна непонятной тоской, и шумно катясь, колебала река, отражённые в ней облака. Okay, so let's now read the poem more carefully, starting with the first stanza, and you see all the notes, vocab notes below the poem. So the first line reads, Rusalka плыла по реке голубой. So you see a certain pattern here in these very early poems, but we're going to see this again sustained across some of his Lermontov's more mature poetry, where we open with someone who's on their way. And of course, this is very neatly expressed by Russian verbs of motion. Earlier, we saw the angel, who was, the verb used was letel, right? The angel was underway flying. And here we have the Rusalka, the subject of this poem in this first line. And then the verb pela. So that's one of our swimming verbs, one of these unprefixed verbs of motion. The three infinitives are плавать, плыть, поплыть. And again, the way I would unpack those meanings are плавать would mean to swim around or to swim back and forth. Плыть means to be underway swimming, or we could say underway by water. This could be, you could be going by boat, for example. And finally, поплыть means to set off by swimming or to set off by water. So here we have this idea clearly conveyed by the verb that the Rusalka is swimming along the river. She's not swimming in circles or anything. Now, this is really interesting because often it's said that determinate verbs of motion like plight, right, that second infinitive, people say that those always convey a firm sense of destination. But that really isn't true. And this is actually kind of a nice example of this. In the poem Angel, it was clear that the angel did have a destination. She was flying towards this world of ours to deliver the young soul and to the moment of its birth. But here, especially as we keep reading the poem, it doesn't seem that the Rusalka is really trying to get anywhere. She's not rushing off to some clear destination. So this reveals really the ultimate point of the difference between these first two unprefixed motion verbs, плавать and плыть. Плавать simply, the indeterminate simply means that someone is swimming around, they're not getting anywhere. So they could be swimming back and forth, swimming in circles, or making round trips or something. But pleit just simply means that they're not doing that. They're not just swimming around aimlessly, but they have some vague sense of being underway, even though they may not, again, be rushing to some literal destination. In this case, we could say she's swimming down the river, along the river. And then, so next we get по реке. So Rusalka плыла по реке. She was swimming down or underway swimming along the river. And then the river is described as голубой, a голубая река. You probably know already that Russian has two basic words for blue, голубой and синий. Both of those are going to figure in this poem. And so it's worth noting here that in the opening of the poem, he's using the adjective голубой, which means a light blue, a lighter blue. And it turns out that may be significant later. Okay, the second line, Озаряема полной луной, that refers to Rusalka. Now, I did kind of a double take there because we know Озаряема is a short form adjective describing something feminine. And of course, you could think that this would mean the river, and that would make sense here because everything is illuminated by the full moon. But because Озаряема is a short form adjective here in the nominative as usual, we see that grammatically at least it's modifying Rusalka. So the Rusalka is Озаряема. That's a present passive participle from озарять. So from the imperfective verb meaning to illuminate. Озаряемый describes something which is being illuminated. So she's illuminated by, and then so this is a passive verb form. We often get the instrumental with those passive forms to tell by which or by whom, whatever is being done. So she's illuminated by the full moon, полной луной, instrumental. Third line, и старалась она доплеснуть до луны серебристую пену волны. This is a nice little example of a verb that's a little hard to translate, maybe. So the main verb here is staralась, right? So as she was swimming along, she was trying, staralась. We have two imperfective verbs communicating simultaneous unfolding actions. So while she was swimming, she was trying to, and then we get a perfective verb. Now, often when you have verbs, a main verb of trying that expresses an effort, and then you say what you're trying to do, that second verb is usually in the perfective because, of course, the purpose really of trying is to do it successfully, right? You're not trying to try to do something, so to speak. It would be kind of redundant. You're trying to completely do it, successfully do it. And indeed, here we get the this verb doplesnуть, which is perfective. So she's trying to splash. The basic verb here is to splash, and the prefix is do, meaning you're reaching something by splashing. You're splashing something all the way to whatever it is. And then that's followed up by de luni, right? So what she's trying to do is to successfully splash, so to speak, the water all the way to the moon. And so we see here that this poem opens really playfully. The tone is one that's, even though it's at night, we have a full moon, everything is illuminated. It's said that the river is a bright blue, a light blue, and we see this Rusalka in this very playful mode, right? Playfully trying to splash the water all the way to the moon. And then, by the way, actually, we don't know so far what she's trying to splash. That's line 4. Серебристую пену волны. So she's trying to splash to the moon the silverish foam of the wave. So серебристый means something that's made from серебро. And if it were literally made of silver, it would be серебряный. So actually, this adjective we have here, серебристый, means that it looks like silver. It's silverish. So the silver-like, silverish foam, pena, of the wave in the genitive. Okay, so second stanza, we open here with two verbal adverbs, right? So two adverbs formed from verbs, and these are both imperfective. So шумя и крутясь means шумя is from шуметь, so this means while making noise, or we might say noisily, or whatever, while making noise and while spinning. So this is from крутиться, meaning to be spinning or swirling about or something. Okay, now so far we know that these are going to need to modify a verb, but we don't have our verb yet, so let's keep reading. And we get it next. We get колебала река. Now look at this line. This is a very common issue when you're reading Russian. You've got to find your subject if you're trying to understand a line for the first time. And remember, the subject could really come anywhere, and quite often, indeed, it comes at the very end of the whole sentence or phrase. And so here we see reka is clearly our subject. It's in the nominative. So the river was колебала. It was shaking. Now this verb here is, again, a really nice example of it. The river was making unsteady. Колебать can mean all sorts of things, but its basic meaning is to shake or make unsteady, to cause to oscillate or undulate or something. So here we're clearly talking about water, so it's quite easy to visualize. Now going back to our adverbs, right? So the river was shaking, let's say. Well, how was it shaking? It was shaking while sounding and swirling, we might say. This verb шуметь means basically just to make a sound, to make a shum. And we don't really say this in English very much. We don't say things were simply sounding. We're usually more specific. And so often when translating this verb, instead of saying the river was sounding, we might say the river was rumbling or babbling, or the brook was babbling. Just whatever the quality of the sound seems to be, we might be more specific. I guess here, if the water is swirling around, it seems to be more than just a little brook. So maybe we might use whatever word we could to describe the sound of rapids. We're also told here, we were told earlier that there are waves in this river. Anyway, so again, what is the river shaking? Now we've seen this pattern twice where we have a subject and a verb, but we're waiting to see what's the object of the verb. So again, this certain suspense is being built up by Lermontov, and I think it's not accidental, right? We're told here that the river is shaking, the clouds reflected in it. So kind of a surprising thing where we see that the river is literally shaking the sky, the heavens. And again, here already he's establishing this contrast between the world below, specifically the world of not even just of earth, but of the waters. And later we'll be going beneath the waters where the Rusalka actually lives. And we see how this kind of underworld, this world of darkness, shrouded by night, is shaking. It's making unsteady or causing to oscillate the heavens, right? The world of light, the world above. The here, as he says specifically, the облака, the clouds, Отражённые в ней, the clouds reflected in it, meaning in the river, right? So в ней goes back to река, in it, feminine, in the river. And Отражённый is a PPP, passive participle. These usually come from perfective verbs, in this case, отразить, right, to reflect. So отражённый means reflected. Okay, let's keep reading. И пела Rusalka. Okay, now for the first time we have her song, right, which is crucial to this poem really is about the song of the Rusalka. Of course, this reminds us of the song of the angel in the previous poem. И пела Rusalka, and the Rusalka was singing. So now we've had three imperfective verbs, all describing, actually we've had four, all describing this ongoing, four ongoing actions that are unfolding across time. So anyway, пела Rusalka и звук ее слов, and the sound of her words, Долетал до крутых берегов. Here's the same prefix do, so the sound of her words was flying, and it was reaching, do, it was flying all the way to the steep banks of the river. Now, this is kind of interesting. It seems like maybe in some ways kind of a throwaway line, although it does imply that the Rusalka's song is reaching the banks of the river, which of course is the whole point. So it's kind of creepy actually to imagine that this song we're hearing here, although again it's very interesting in its own right, the true purpose may be to lure men into the river and drown them. And it's interesting here that, as we'll see in a moment, the Rusalka doesn't seem to be entirely aware of what she's doing, which makes this what makes, I think, this poem so unusual and so haunting. But let's keep reading. Let's go to the next two stanzas. And now we'll begin hearing what she's actually singing about. И пела Rusalka, на дне у меня играет мерцанье дня. And the Rusalka sang, at the bottom, на дне, that means at the dno, right up on the dno, that is the bottom of whatever. This could be the bottom of a bottle, the bottom of a, you say drink до dna, all the way to the bottom. In this case, it's the bottom of the river. So на дне у меня, at the bottom, у меня, literally at me, but that implies where she lives, right? So we might say at the bottom of the river where I dwell, where I live. What happens there? Играет мерцанье дня. The мерцанье of the день, the brilliance of the day, the light of the day, kind of the sparkling light. That's мерцанье. Plays. So this verb играть could mean to play a game or to play an instrument, like we'd say in English, but it can also describe things like the so to speak, the play of light. If light is bouncing around and refracting in various ways, you can use играть to capture that kind of playful, bouncing around of the light. Again, we see, sticking with this earlier idea, the light here is refracted and is dancing around in the bottom of this kind of magical, mysterious river where the Rusalka lives. And she goes on to describe this kind of underwater kingdom, right? Там рыбок золотых гуляют стада. So what's the subject there? Stada, right? So the plural of stada, stada. A stada is a group of animals. So in this case, schools of fish, specifically stada zlatych rybok, schools of golden fish. Little fish, by the way. He's using the term, the word rybka, the diminutive, instead of simply ryba. So little tiny fish, and there's zlatые rybki. Zlatoy is one of those old-fashioned adjectives, so slightly high style, but the modern equivalent would be zolotoy. Remember, in this case also, by using zlatoy, he's saving a syllable, so it also helps him with his meter, which I should talk about more in a moment. Anyway, so these schools of little golden fish, gulyayut, they're usually гулять would mean to stroll around, often kind of for fun, like to гулять through a city, to stroll through a city for fun. This can also imply sort of something like, kind of a bar crawl, right, where you're kind of partying, you're in party mode and you're moving from one place to another, or walking around just having a good time. So anyway, fourth line of this third stanza, Tam хрустальные есть города. There are cities made of crystal. So хрусталь means crystal, хрустальный means made of crystal. So crystalline cities are there, right? So this, again, this kind of wondrous world at the bottom of the river. So again, you see how so far although we have certain foreshadowings in terms of this difference between the world of light and the world of darkness, so far the tone is very kind of playful, but it's about to take a very dark turn. And by the way, in a lot of poems, you expect this kind of thing. At some point, there's some kind of a turn in the poem and things suddenly shift and you start to get a sense of what this poem is really about. And this happens here in the fourth stanza. И там на подушке из ярких песков, and there on a pillow, on a padushka, and what's the pillow made of? Из ярких песков. It's made from яркие пески. So песок means sand, and яркий is a word that this also sometimes is troublesome to translate, but it basically means brightly colored or vivid. It's something that's bright or striking. Here, I guess she means kind of, remember that the light is dancing across the bottom of the river. And so maybe it's also that, right? The light is dancing across these brilliant sands that form a pillow. Also somewhat creepy because we assume they don't literally form a pillow, but using this kind of, it makes it sound like we're still in the world of human beings, but we're clearly not. We're in a very strange world. Anyway, let's keep reading and you'll see what we're driving at here. Под тенью густых тростников, beneath the shade of thick reeds. So the trostnik, these reeds would, of course, grow on the riverbanks or whatever. And here we're beneath the shade of these thick reeds in the genitive plural. Тень means a shade or a shadow. Spit vitis. Okay, finally we get a second persona introduced here. You see how, again, we've had this suspense, right? He's introduced the pillow and we're thinking, who is sleeping on this pillow? And then that the answer is postponed by more description. And finally, when we hear who's sleeping on this pillow, it's more striking, right? There sleeps a vitis. A vitis is basically a warrior, but it would also be sort of from the realm of folklore or legend, right? It's not just an ordinary soldier, it's kind of a warrior. And the warrior is described as the добыча ревнивой волны, the prey of the jealous wave. Now there you see kind of almost a sort of projection, right? It's not the wave that claimed this warrior. It was, of course, the Rusalka. But again, you see here too reflected this sense that she doesn't really understand even what she's done. The fact that she's drowned this warrior, because presumably she's tried to draw these men to the river because she loves them, and she doesn't understand that by embracing them and drawing them to her, she's going to kill them. And so in this case, in this line here, it's expressed rather brilliantly by her, in effect, blaming the revnivaya volna, the jealous wave, for having taken this warrior. And she also uses the verb to sleep, right? She, again, as I suggested earlier, it's clear to us now that this warrior has been drowned already. It's obvious. And but she doesn't say that he's dead. She says instead that he's sleeping. It's clear that she doesn't even understand what death is. She's dead herself, or somehow undead. But again, we see in so many senses here this kind of ambiguous realm between sleep and death, or between life and death, and so forth. So then she repeats here in her song, "Spit vitis чужой стороны." There sleeps a warrior of a foreign land, of a foreign realm. Чужая страна. Strana in modern Russian means a side or a direction, but really, historically, it's the same word as strana, which today means a country. But in fact, strana is the older form of the polnoglossio word, as I explained in the last video, starana, right? It's actually the same word, but we now have two versions of it, and in this case, the two versions have come to mean different things in Russian. Okay, so let's keep reading here. Next stanza. Remember, she's still singing, and she says, "Расчесывать кольца шелковых кудрей мы любим во мраке ночей." This is the first point where we see that there are multiple Rusalki, kind of like in the painting by Kramskoy, right? We love, мы любим во мраке ночей, in the darkness of the nights, literally, genitive plural. What do they love to do? Расчесывать, to comb. And this here is an imperfective verb implying an activity that they enjoy the ongoing activity. And they also are doing this repeatedly, right? So imperfective. They like to comb the kolsa, the rings of the silken curls, right? So sholkavi means some. Normally the stress here is sholkavi, but here we have sholkovi. That's just a variation here we're seeing in the poem for the sake of the meter. And then kudrei there in the genitive plural, right? The rings of these silken curls, meaning this warrior's hair. So here we're imagining them combing, again, the hair of this corpse, again, clearly not understanding what really has befallen this warrior. And let's keep reading. И в чело, и в уста мы в полуденный час целовали красавца не раз. So we get, again, the escalation here to quite disturbing. So we get EE, right? So both on the brow and both on the lips. We, в полуденный час, at a noontime hour, in midday, have целовали красавца не раз. We have kissed this handsome man, не раз. Now note that не раз means is different from the expression ni razu. Ni razu means you haven't done something a single time, but ni raz actually means kind of the opposite. It means you've done it not once, meaning that you've done it multiple times, right? So this means many a time, we might say, or on many an occasion, right? So on many a time we've kissed this handsome man. Now, at this point, another thing we can clearly deduce is that this is literally a corpse. This is, at this point, if they've been kissing this warrior day after day, then he's presumably very badly composed. But they seem oblivious to that. They describe him as a krasavets, as a handsome man. So this poem is getting more and more macabre. Let's keep reading, and now we get this is the final stanza of the Rusalka's song, and again, Lermontov is sort of reaching the emotional climax of this whole poem here when she sings «Но к страстным лобзаньям, не знаю зачем, остается он хладен и нем». But this «но», right? So here's a very pointed break from her song thus far, right? «Но». To our passionate kisses, не знаю зачем, I don't know why. Остается он хладен и нем. He remains cold and mute, unresponsive. Okay, so at this point, we see that she has this intimation that her lover, so to speak, is not requiting her love. So for her, this is simply a story, I guess, of unrequited love and a certain sadness. It's not clear how deeply she's really affected by this, but she does seem to at least be aware that there's something going on here that she doesn't understand. But again, rather creepily, she thinks of it just purely in terms of unrequited love and not in terms of death. So there's a lot of dramatic irony here where we as readers, of course, understand what's happening, but she doesn't. But I think just kind of I'll go ahead and say it right now. It seems to me that here Lermontov is inviting us to see the existence of this strange creature, which in a way is mirroring our own, right? This same kind of longing and maybe unrequited love or unrequited desire that everyone can understand. But here it's presented in this extremely strange folkloric context, and we see it in a completely new light. Anyway, он спит, и склонившись на персы ко мне, он не дышит, не шепчет во сне. He sleeps. So there's the refrain of this sleeping image. И склонившись, and having inclined, here speaking of his head, presumably, or maybe his whole upper body. The verb being used here is, the form is sklanivshis, which is a reflexive verbal adverb. So this means having inclined. The verb sklonять or sklonить means to incline something, meaning to tilt it kind of in one direction, or maybe to tilt it downward. In this case, we have the intransitive verb. His whole head, or we could say maybe his upper body, is inclining or tilting or bowing onto her chest. It's a little hard to translate this or really even unpack it, but I think it's very easy to visualize. Remember, he's a corpse, and so he's resting upon her breast or chest. Uh, so again, on the one hand, it seems very romantic, a romantic gesture, almost motherly, but again, we because of what we know as readers, it's extremely disturbing. And she closes by saying, "On не дышит, не шепчет во сне." He doesn't breathe and doesn't whisper in his sleep. Okay, now, so we opened with the sort of the activities of the Rusalka, then with her song, which is ended on this kind of disturbing note. And now we get the final stanza, and we expect some kind of closure here, some kind of culmination of all the themes of the poem. And of course, we get it. So he says, "Tak pela Rusalka nad sinyi rekoi." Thus sang the Rusalka above the deep blue river. Now look, there's what I warned you about earlier. It's no longer a голубая reka, but a sinyaya reka. So just in literal terms here, the whole tone, the color of the poem has darkened. It's gone from a light blue to a deeper or even a dark blue. We might imagine, he mentioned clouds earlier. We could maybe imagine that one of the clouds has obscured the moonlight, and that explains why the river is suddenly a deeper blue. But it reflects the whole tone of the poem. And this is a great example of how a brilliant poet like Lermontov, with such an obvious genius, even at such a young age, every little detail in the poem hangs together. Every word, every little detail contributes to the overall atmosphere of the poem. And you'll see this with almost any great poetry you read in Russian, from the likes of Lermontov, and especially Pushkin. Pushkin is, of course, the gold standard for this type of thing, and you never see a word wasted from Pushkin. But anyway, so thus she sang above the deep blue river, and then that means that she's swimming on the surface of the water. It doesn't mean she's floating above the river, of course. And then maybe in some ways the key line to the whole poem, she's now described as полна непонятной тоской, right? Filled by an incomprehensible longing. And there's that theme we mentioned earlier, right? This toska, this longing that she can't even fully understand. And let's go ahead and finish. И шумно крутясь колебала река, Отражённые в ней облака. And noisily rolling. So this verb крутясь, that's another verbal adverb from the verb кататься, катиться, покатиться, which means to be underway, to roll around, to be underway rolling, or to set out rolling. So it's a less common unprefixed verb of motion, but it has to do with rolling. In this case, we could say maybe we could say the river was rolling on, but it was noisily rolling on. Let's say this, put it this way: шумно крутясь, and that's all describing the reka. The main verb is again колебала. It was shaking or causing to oscillate. And again, we see here that we're getting the repetition from earlier in the poem, which is also quite common at the end of a poem. We get something repeated. But I'll also point this out. This is also the feature of so many of these brilliant classical Russian poems, where there's a repetition at the very end of the poem, sometimes word for word, just even a word for word literal repetition. But because of what's happened in the poem, the progression, we see this repetition, we see whatever it is in a completely new light. And so earlier, this reflection of the sky maybe didn't really strike us, but now we see that this is really what the entire poem is doing, right? It's taken our kind of the world as we assume it normally is, and it's made it it's unsettled it quite literally. It's caused it to waver, to oscillate, to shake like ripples in water, and nothing anymore is certain. And yet our final phrase here is the Отражённые в ней облака, this reflection of the clouds in the water. So I guess there's more we could say about this, but I guess I'll leave off there. The only thing I wanted to add, as I mentioned earlier, was the meter of the poem. And hopefully you noticed as we were reading after the last video that this is also in a ternary meter, just like Angel. So it seems that young Lermontov had a certain love for these ternary meters. Again, the way to spot this is by listening for two unstressed syllables in between stressed syllables. So if we take the first line, it's Rusalka, plыла по реке голубой, right? Озаряема, полной, луной. Again, it's pretty easy to hear that ternary meter even without any further analysis. So at this point, if we think back to the route this poem is taken, we started above the water, like the Rusalka who was swimming along the surface. And I think it's actually essential that it was her song, right? So again, this theme of singing and more broadly poetry or music. It was her song that allowed us to descend into this underworld, into this dark realm, kind of creepy realm that is the Rusalka's own world. Of course, we should also remember that she herself, without apparently remembering it, was once a human being. And that, I like to try to explain everything psychologically. I think there's a lot of kind of rigor here to a lot of these poems that might otherwise seem kind of silly. But why would the Rusalka be singing about a padushka, a pillow? There's no such thing at the bottom of a river. Well, maybe she has some dim memory of what a pillow does in the world of human beings, and she's kind of injecting that here because she imagines that this sleeping man should be resting his head on a pillow. But anyway, it's the power of her song. It's the power of the song or poetry that both inhabits this space between two worlds and allows the listener to usually transcend the world into the realm of the heavens. And that's more typical in Lermontov's poetry. But here we have a descent, right? So everything is kind of inverted. And it's the poem that allows us to descend into this darker realm and maybe gain some sort of insight into it. And then at the very end, we reemerge into the world of daylight, so to speak. Now, another thing to think about this, and sort of my final comment, is to the extent that we've been lured in by this beautiful poem, which of course is basically the song of the Rusalka, then we should be dead at this point. And again, it's remarkable how, even though this may seem like almost a kind of a flippant comment, this is actually, I think, essential, especially when in some of these later poems we're going to read, like Swan, where we are going to be speaking about this ambiguous space between life and death in a quite literal sense. So really, we should be dead. We should have been drowned. But I guess because of our kind of privileged position as readers, as sort of disembodied observers, we've been allowed to descend into the world beneath and to see the fate of this Vichys. And now we've reemerged from that kind of watery grave back to the normal world. And yet at this point, as it's said here at the end, everything now is different. Everything has been shaken. Our normal perception of the world has been deeply shaken, hopefully, by this poem. But anyway, that's enough for today. So we'll continue with Lermontov next time. And until then, до свидания, товарищи.